In the sleepy village of St. Mary's Mead, a gleaming 1928 Bentley vanishes from a bustling summer fete, sparking whispers of betrayal and greed. Was it the pompous Colonel Ashby, guarding a secret? The debt-ridden mechanic, Tommy Pierce, tempted by a shady offer? The stern Judge Grayson, hiding financial woes? Or the charming collector, Percival Worthington, whose obsession knows no bounds? Only Miss Jane Marple, with her knitting needles and razor-sharp mind, can unravel the clues, cufflinks, tire marks, and a hidden garage, to expose a thief in this classic tale of deception and deduction. Chapter 1. The Gleaming Pride of St. Mary's Mead. The sun hung low over St. Mary's Mead, casting a golden glow across the village green, where the annual summer fete bustled with life. Laughter mingled with the clink of teacups, and the scent of freshly baked scones wafted from the refreshment tent. At the heart of the festivities stood the antique card display, a collection of polished relics that drew gasps from villagers and visitors alike. None shone brighter than Colonel Reginald Ashby's 1928 Bentley 4.5-liter, its emerald green body and gleaming chrome a testament to a bygone era of elegance. The car, roped off like a museum piece, commanded attention, its curves reflecting the August light with almost insolent pride. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a sprawling oak, her knitting needles clicking softly in rhythm with the hum of the crowd. Her straw hat, tilted just so, shaded her sharp blue eyes as they darted from face to face, taking in the scene with the quiet precision of a watchmaker. She wore a simple lavender dress, its neatness a reflection of her ordered mind, and her hands moved with practiced ease, the half-finished scarf in her lap growing imperceptibly. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster enjoying the fete, but Miss Marple missed nothing. Colonel Ashby strutted beside his Bentley, his chest puffed out like a peacock's, his military mustache quivering as he regaled a small crowd with tales of the car's provenance. "Raced at Le Mans, you know," he boomed, his voice carrying over the chatter. "One of only a handful left in the world, worth a king's ransom." His pride was palpable, but Miss Marple noted a certain brittleness in his smile, as if the weight of maintaining such a treasure pressed heavily upon him. Nearby, young Tommy Pierce, the colonel's mechanic, hovered nervously by the Bentley's hood. His oil-stained overalls hung loosely on his lanky frame, and his fingers twitched as he polished an already spotless fender. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, catching the way. His eyes flicked toward the crowd, as if searching for someone, or something. She made a mental note of his unease, wondering what troubles might lie behind those darting glances. Across the green, Judge Harold Grayson stood at the judges' table, his tall, austere figure cutting a stark contrast to the festive chaos. His gray suit was immaculate, his expression one of detached superiority, as he surveyed the cars with a critical eye. Miss Marple had known men like him, men whose fairness masked a deep well of private resentments. He paused by the Bentley, his lips pursing briefly before he moved on. The gesture was fleeting, but Miss Marple tucked it away, like a stray thread to be woven into place later. Her attention shifted to a newcomer, a man whose polished air set him apart from the villagers. Mr. Percival Worthington, she learned from Mrs. Price's whispered gossip, was a wealthy collector from London, known for his obsession with rare automobiles. He lingered by the Bentley, his gloved hand hovering just above the chrome, as if caressing an idea. His tailored suit and easy smile spoke of charm, but Miss Marple caught a glint of something sharper in his eyes, a hunger, perhaps, or calculation. He glanced at Colonel Ashby, then at Tommy, before slipping back into the crowd with the grace of a cat. As the afternoon waned, the fete reached its peak. Children darted through the grass, clutching balloons, while the vicar announced the winners of the flower show. Miss Marple, her knitting paused, watched the Bentley's admirers come and go, her mind turning over the small details that others overlooked: the colonel's boastful tone, Tommy's restless hands, the judge's fleeting frown, and Mr. Worthington's lingering gaze. She sensed a current beneath the surface, a ripple of unease that belied the day's cheer. Then, as the clock tower struck 6, a shout shattered the calm. "It's gone!" Colonel Ashby's voice, raw with disbelief, cut through the crowd. Heads turned, murmurs rose, and a throng gathered around the empty space where the Bentley had stood. The ropes lay slack, the grass beneath undisturbed save for the faintest imprint of tires. Constable Harris pushed through, his notebook already open, but the villagers' shock was palpable. A car of such size, such value, could not simply vanish. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her expression serene, but her mind alight. She rose, brushing a stray leaf from her skirt, and approached the scene with the unhurried step of one who knew that answers lay not in haste, but in observation. The colonel's face was crimson, Tommy's pale, the judge's impassive, and Mr. Worthington, curiously, had slipped away. The fate, so bright moments ago, now hummed with suspicion. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, and she thought, not for the first time, that the quiet of St. Mary Mead was a blessing. Mary's Mead was never quite what it seemed. Chapter 2. The Colonel's Outrage. The morning after the summer fete dawned crisp and clear, with a breeze that carried the scent of lavender across St. Mary's Mead. The village, however, buzzed with a less pleasant fragrance: scandal. The theft of Colonel Reginald Ashby's 1928 Bentley 4.5-liter had set tongues wagging from the post office to the vicarage, each villager offering a theory more outlandish than the last. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her rose-trimmed parlor with a cup of Earl Grey, listened to her maid, Florence, recount the morning's gossip as she dusted the mantelpiece. "They're saying it's gypsies, Miss Marple," Florence said, her eyes wide. "Or maybe that young Tommy Pierce, up to no good with his gambling ways." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm, and murmured something non-committal. She knew better than to trust the village's penchant for melodrama. The truth, she suspected, lay in quieter details. By noon, Miss Marple found herself invited to Ashby Manor, the colonel's imposing Georgian residence on the edge of the village. The invitation, delivered by a flustered footman, was less a courtesy than a summons, for Colonel Ashby was not a man accustomed to being ignored. Miss Marple, dressed in a neat tweed skirt and a cardigan of soft lilac, made her way along the gravel path, her sensible shoes crunching softly. The manor's oak doors loomed before her, flanked by stone urns overflowing with geraniums, and she was ushered into a drawing-room where the colonel awaited, his face a thundercloud. Colonel Ashby stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his military bearing undiminished by age. His mustache, meticulously trimmed, bristled as he spoke, and his eyes, though sharp, held a flicker of unease. "Miss Marple," he began without preamble, "I trust you've heard of my misfortune. That blasted Bentley, gone, stolen right under our noses. It's an outrage, a damned outrage." His voice, accustomed to barking orders, filled the room, and the crystal decanters on the sideboard seemed to tremble in sympathy. Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered armchair, her hands folded primly in her lap. "Indeed, Colonel, it is most distressing," she said, her tone gentle, but her eyes keen. "A car of such value and rarity does not vanish without purpose. Perhaps you could tell me more about yesterday's events. Every detail, however small, might prove useful." The Colonel, pacing now, launched into his account with the precision of a campaign report. He had arrived at the fete at noon, he said, to ensure the Bentley was properly displayed. The car had been polished to a mirror finish by Tommy Pierce, whom he described as a decent lad, but flighty, you know, too fond of the horses. By 2 p.m., the crowd had thickened, and the Colonel, as a member of the Fate Committee, had been called to judge the pie contest. He had left Tommy in charge of the Bentley, with strict instructions to remain by its side. "I last saw it at 4 o'clock, he said, his voice rising. "I checked on it before the pie awards. Not a scratch on her, gleaming like a jewel. Then, at 6, when I returned, nothing. Just an empty patch of grass and those damned ropes lying there like a taunt." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite concern, but her mind was already sifting through his words. The Colonel's indignation was genuine, she thought, but there was something in his quickness to mention Tommy that piqued her interest. "And you trust young Tommy, do you?" she asked, her voice mild as milk. The Colonel snorted, pausing to pour himself a brandy from the decanter. "Trust? I suppose so, in a pinch. He's been with me 2 years, knows engines inside out. But he's got debts, Miss Marple. Gambling debts, the fool. I've heard whispers he owes money to some unsavory types in Danemouth. If he's mixed up in this, I'll have his hide." His fist clenched, and Miss Marple noted the vein pulsing at his temple. Anger, yes, but also a trace of fear. Fear of betrayal, perhaps, or of something deeper. She sipped her tea, which had been brought by a silent maid, and steered the conversation gently. "You mentioned the car's value, Colonel. A king's ransom, I believe you said. Are there many who knew its worth?" Ashby's eyes narrowed. Anyone with half a brain at the fete could see it was no ordinary motor. I made no secret of it. Why should I? It's a 1928 Bentley 4.5 liter, one of the finest ever made. Raced at Le Mans, you know, and still runs like a dream. Collectors would kill for it. He paused, catching himself, and added hastily, "Not literally, of course, but it's no surprise someone had their eye on it. That Judge Grayson, for instance, kept sniffing around, acting superior. And there was a fellow, some city type, asking too many questions. Worthington, they called him." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. "Mr. Percival Worthington, I presume?" she said, recalling the suave stranger from the fete. "A collector, I understand." "Collector, ha!" the Colonel scoffed. "More like a vulture. Kept circling the Bentley, touching it like it was his already. Said he admired its lines. But I know that look. Covetous, that's what it was. If anyone had motive, it's him." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. "And then there's Grayson, always acting high and mighty, but I've heard he's had money trouble since that bad investment in 23. Might have thought to line his pockets with my car." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild surprise, though she was anything but surprised. The Colonel's readiness to point fingers was telling, a reflex born of pride, or perhaps deflection. She made a mental note of his accusations, each a thread to be unraveled later. "And what of the car's security?" she asked. "Were there any measures beyond Tommy's watch?" The colonel hesitated, his bluster faltering. "Well, the ropes, of course, and I'd locked the ignition. Special key, custom made. Only I have it." He patted his waistcoat pocket, then frowned. "Though I suppose a clever thief could bypass that. Tommy would know how, mind you. He's tinkered with the engine enough." His tone darkened again, circling back to the mechanic. Miss Marple let the silence linger, a tactic she had perfected over years of drawing out truths. The colonel, uncomfortable under her steady gaze, shifted topics, recounting the fate's other events, the flower show, the children's races, the vicar's speech. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the colonel's narrative. His pride in the Bentley was evident, but so was his quickness to blame others. Tommy, Worthington, even Grayson. She wondered if his outrage masked a deeper anxiety, perhaps about his own oversight in the car's protection. As the conversation wound down, Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "You've been most helpful, Colonel," she said. "I'm sure Constable Harris will get to the bottom of this. A car like that cannot stay hidden for long." Her words were soothing, but her eyes lingered on the colonel's waistcoat, where a faint bulge suggested the custom key he'd mentioned. She thanked him for the tea and stepped out into the manor's garden, where the geraniums glowed in the afternoon light. Outside, she paused by the gate, her mind turning over the morning's revelations. The colonel's story held no obvious contradictions, but its edges were frayed with suspicion. Tommy's debts, Worthington's interest, Grayson's troubles, all were pieces of a puzzle that did not yet fit. She thought of her nephew, Raymond, who often teased her for seeing mysteries in every village squabble, but Miss Marple knew better. Human nature, she had learned, was the same in St. Mary's Mead as in the grandest cities, and greed, envy, or desperation could drive even the most respectable to folly. As she walked back to her cottage, the village green was quiet, the fates' tents dismantled, leaving only trampled grass and the memory of the Bentleys gleam. Miss Marple's steps were slow, her mind swift. The colonel's outrage was a starting point, but it was only that, a beginning. She would need to see Tommy Pierce next to gauge his fear against his employer's accusations. And then there was Worthington with his polished charm, and Grayson with his aloof disdain. Each had a role in this drama. She was certain, though whether as actor or audience remained to be seen. Back at her cottage, Florence greeted her with a fresh pot of tea and more gossip. "They're saying at the Blue Boar that Mr. Worthington's been asking about hiring a van," she said, her voice hushed with excitement. Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. A van, she thought, could carry a car, or conceal it. She filed the tidbit away, alongside the colonel's words, and the faint unease she'd sensed in his manner. The Bentley's theft was no random act, she was sure, but a calculated move by someone who knew its value and saw their chance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across, her parlor, Miss Marple's mind, was already tracing the threads that would lead her to the truth, one quiet observation at a time. Chapter 3. The Mechanic's Tale. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary's Mead as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the modest garage on the village's western edge, where Tommy Pierce worked. The air carried the faint tang of motor oil and freshly cut grass, and the distant chime of the church clock marked the hour as 4:30. Miss Marple, in her familiar tweed coat and a hat adorned with a single primrose, walked with the unhurried gait of one who knew haste seldom uncovered truth. Her mind, however, was anything but leisurely, turning over Colonel Ashby's accusations and the curious undercurrent of unease she had sensed at the manor. The garage, a squat brick building with a corrugated tin roof, stood slightly apart from the village's neat cottages, its doors open to reveal a clutter of tools and engine parts. Tommy Pierce was inside, bent over the engine of a battered Morris Minor, his hands blackened with grease. His lanky frame stiffened as Miss Marple approached, her footsteps soft but deliberate on the gravel path. She paused at the threshold, her clear blue eyes taking in the scene. A workbench strewn with wrenches, a half-empty bottle of lemonade, and tucked in a corner, a toolbox that seemed oddly out of place, its lid slightly ajar. "Good afternoon, Tommy," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, but carrying the quiet authority of one accustomed to being heard. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." Tommy straightened, wiping his hands on a rag that did little to clean them. His face, boyish despite his 23 years, was pale, and his eyes darted toward the toolbox before meeting hers. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Didn't expect you here. Something about the Colonel's car, I reckon?" His attempt at nonchalance was betrayed by the nervous twitch of his fingers. "Indeed," she replied, stepping into the garage and settling onto a rickety stool, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "A most unfortunate business, the Bentley's disappearance. The Colonel is quite distressed, as you can imagine. He mentioned you were guarding it yesterday. Perhaps you could tell me what happened." Tommy's shoulders slumped, and he leaned against the Morris, his rag twisting in his hands. "I've told Constable Harris already," he said, a defensive edge to his tone. "I was by the car all day, like the Colonel said, polished it, kept the kids from touching it. Then, round 4:30, I stepped away for a minute. Just a minute, mind you, to fetch a clean cloth from the tent. When I got back, the car was gone. Didn't hear a thing, didn't see a thing." His voice rose, and he looked at her with a mixture of defiance and desperation. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly concern, though her mind was cataloging every word, every gesture. "A minute is not long," she said, "but long enough, it seems. Did anyone approach the car while you were there? Anyone who seemed unusually interested?" Tommy hesitated, his eyes flickering again to the toolbox. "Plenty of folks looked," he said. "It's a beauty, that Bentley. The judge, Mr. Grayson, he came by, said something about its engineering. And that London fellow, Worthington, is it? He was there a while, asking about the engine, the history, seemed proper keen." He paused, then added quickly, "But no one touched it, not while I was there." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile, the kind that invited confidence without demanding it. "And yet it vanished," she said softly. "Tell me, Tommy, was there anything else you noticed? Perhaps something you didn't think to mention to Constable Harris? Even the smallest detail might help." Tommy shifted, his rag now a knotted mess in his hands. "Nothing, Miss Marple. Honest, I was just doing my job." But his voice faltered, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the briefest glance toward his pocket, where a scrap of paper protruded, its edge crumpled as if handled repeatedly. She leaned forward slightly, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "You're a good lad, Tommy, and I know you wouldn't want to disappoint the Colonel. But if there's something troubling you, something you're afraid to say, it's better to share it now. Secrets have a way of coming out, you know." For a moment, Tommy looked as if he might bolt, his eyes wide with the panic of a cornered animal. Then he sagged, his defiance crumbling. "It's nothing, really," he mumbled, pulling the scrap of paper from his pocket. "Just this. Found it in my toolbox yesterday before the fete. Don't know how it got there." He handed it to her, his fingers trembling. Miss Marple unfolded the paper with care. It was a torn piece of notepaper bearing a scrawled message in black ink. "Look the other way at 4:30. Your debts are cleared. P.W." The initials sent a spark through her mind, connecting to the collector, Percival Worthington. She folded the note and slipped it into her handbag, her face betraying no surprise. "Who gave you this, Tommy?" she asked, her voice still gentle, but now laced with a quiet insistence. "I don't know," he burst out, his voice rising. "I swear, Miss Marple, I found it there, in the toolbox, when I was setting up for the fete. I didn't do nothing with it. I was by the car, like I said, and I only stepped away for that cloth. I didn't take no bribe." His words tumbled out, and his face flushed with a mixture of shame and fear. Miss Marple regarded him, her eyes searching his. She saw no guile there, only the raw honesty of a young man caught in a web he didn't fully understand. "I believe you, Tommy," she said at last, and his shoulders relaxed slightly. "But you must tell Constable Harris about this. Note? It may be important, and you mustn't destroy it, or anything else that might help." Tommy nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I didn't want trouble," he muttered. I owe money, Miss Marple. Bad sorts in Danemouth. The Colonel's right about that, but I'd never betray him, not after all he's done for me." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her coat. "You're in a difficult spot, Tommy, but honesty is the best way out. Keep that note safe and speak to the constable. I'll see what more I can learn." She paused at the garage door, her gaze lingering on the toolbox. "And perhaps tidy that toolbox of yours. It looks as if it's seen some unexpected visitors." As she stepped back into the sunlight, Miss Marple's mind was already weaving the threads of Tommy's story into the larger tapestry. The note, with its cryptic offer and telltale initials, pointed to Worthington, but she cautioned herself against haste. People, she knew, were rarely as simple as they seemed, and a note could be a plant as easily as a promise. Tommy's fear was genuine, but whether it stemmed from guilt or innocence remained unclear. His debts, too, were a motive, or a lever someone might use against him. She thought of the fete, the crowd's bustle, the Bentley's gleaming presence. Tommy's brief absence at 4:30 coincided with the Colonel's absence at the pie contest, a window of opportunity for a thief with nerve and knowledge. Worthington's interest in the car was undeniable, but what of Grayson, with his aloof inspection? And the Colonel himself, his outrage had been fierce, but Miss Marple had seen men protest too loudly to cover their own tracks. As she walked back toward the village, the church clock struck 5, and the green was alive with children playing tag. Miss Marple's steps were slow, her mind racing. The note in her handbag was a clue, but not the only one. She needed to see the show grounds again, to look for traces the thief might have left, and she needed to learn more about Worthington, whose charm, she suspected, masked a sharper intent. For now, though, Tommy's tale had given her a starting point, a thread to tug, gently but firmly, until the truth unraveled. Back at her cottage, she settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed. Florence bustled in with a tray of scones, chattering about the village's latest theories. A gang from London, a prank gone wrong. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The Bentley's theft was no prank, she was certain, but a carefully planned act. And somewhere, in the tangle of motives and moments, lay the key to its disappearance. She smiled faintly, her eyes bright with the quiet thrill of the chase. Chapter 4. The Judge's Disdain. The following morning, St. Mary's Mead awoke to a sky bruised with clouds, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the weather, set out for the village hall, where Judge Harold Grayson was known to hold court over the Fates paperwork. Her umbrella, a sturdy black affair, swung at her side, and her sensible shoes navigated the damp cobblestones with care. Her mind, as ever, was sharp, sifting through the threads of Tommy Pierce's nervous confession and the Colonel's blustering accusations. The note with P.W. lingered in her thoughts, but she knew better than to fixate on one clue. Human nature, she had learned, revealed itself in glances and silences, and Judge Grayson's cool detachment at the fete had caught her eye. The village hall, a modest building with ivy creeping up its stone walls, hummed with the quiet industry of volunteers tidying up after the fete. Miss Marple entered, her lavender scarf neatly knotted, and found Grayson at a long oak table, surrounded by ledgers and lists. His gray suit was as immaculate as it had been at the showgrounds, his posture rigid, as if he carried the weight of his authority, even in this mundane task. His face, lined but stern, betrayed no warmth as he looked up, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers with a flicker of impatience. "Good morning, Judge Grayson," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear, as she took a seat opposite him without waiting for an invitation. "I hope I'm not intruding. I thought you might spare a moment to discuss the unfortunate business with Colonel Ashby's Bentley." Grayson's lips thinned, and he set down his pen with deliberate precision. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone clipped, "I'm not sure what I can add. A theft, regrettable, but hardly my concern. I was judging the awards, not guarding cars." His words were polite, but there was a sharpness beneath them, a hint of disdain for the fuss the village had stirred up. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Of course," she said, "but you were at the judge's table, with a clear view of the showgrounds. It occurred to me that you might have noticed something. Someone lingering, perhaps, or an unusual movement." She paused, her eyes steady, watching for the smallest shift in his demeanor. Grayson leaned back, his fingers steepled. "I saw nothing out of the ordinary," he said. "The crowd was thick, the cars were admired, and I was occupied with my duties. The Colonel's Bentley was a spectacle, naturally, but I had no reason to watch it closely. I was at the table from 3 until the awards at 5, and then I stayed until the commotion began at 6. His voice was steady, his alibi rehearsed, but Miss Marple caught a faint tightening at the corner of his mouth, as if he resented the question. She nodded, her hands resting lightly on her handbag. "A busy afternoon, to be sure," she said. "And yet you did inspect the Bentley earlier, did you not? I recall you pausing by it, perhaps admiring its craftsmanship." Grayson's eyes narrowed, but he answered smoothly. "I may have glanced at it. It's a fine piece of engineering, though I've no personal interest in such things. Ashby's always flaunting his wealth, hardly discreet, but that's his way. The criticism was subtle, but Miss Marple noted it, along with the faint edge of bitterness in his tone. She thought of the village gossip about Grayson's financial troubles, a bad investment that had dented his pride more than his purse, and wondered if envy played a role in his detachment. "Indeed," she said, her voice as mild as ever. "The colonel does take pride in his possessions. It must be trying for someone of your discernment, judging such a show with all its ostentation." She let the word hang, watching for a reaction. Grayson's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Ostentation is no crime, Miss Marple, though it invites trouble. If Ashby's car was stolen, I'd wager it was his own carelessness, or that mechanic of his. Young Pierce has a reputation, you know. Debts, questionable associates." His tone was measured, but the deflection was clear, and Miss Marple's lips twitched in the faintest of smiles. Grayson, like the colonel, was quick to point fingers, and she wondered if it was habit or strategy. She shifted the conversation, her tone conversational. "You must have seen many people pass by the Bentley. That gentleman from London, Mr. Worthington, for instance. He seemed quite taken with it. Did you notice him?" Grayson's expression remained impassive, but his fingers paused in their steepled arrangement. "Worthington? Yes, I saw him. A collector, they say. He was asking questions about the cars, the Bentley included. Seemed knowledgeable, but I paid him no mind. My focus was on the awards." He leaned forward slightly, as if to dismiss her. "Really, Miss Marple, this is a matter for Constable Harris. I've told you all I know." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene. "Of course, Judge Grayson, you've been most helpful. It's just that one never knows what small detail might matter. A glance, a gesture. You've a keen eye, I'm sure." She rose, smoothing her scarf, but her gaze lingered on his shoes, polished to a mirror shine despite the dusty showgrounds. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple had learned to trust small things. As she stepped outside, the first drops of rain pattered against her umbrella. She paused under the hall's awning, her mind turning over Grayson's words. His alibi was solid, or so he thought, but his disdain for the colonel's display hinted at a deeper resentment. She recalled the village whispers about his financial strain, a blow to a man whose pride rested on his reputation for probity. Envy, she knew, could fester in even the most upright hearts, and Grayson's polished exterior might conceal a crack or two. She thought, too, of his shoes. Too clean for a man who had spent hours on the trampled grass of the fete. Had he truly been at the judge's table all afternoon, or had he stepped away, unnoticed in the crowd's bustle? And his quickness to mention Tommy's debts echoed the colonel's accusations, a pattern that suggested either truth or collusion. As for Worthington, Grayson's dismissal of him was too casual, too practiced. Miss Marple's mind flickered to the note in Tommy's pocket, the PW that pointed to the collector. Was Grayson deflecting suspicion, or simply unaware? The rain began to fall in earnest, and Miss Marple opened her umbrella, her steps slow as she made her way back to the village green. The showgrounds lay ahead, now sodden and deserted, but she resolved to return when the weather cleared. There were clues there, she was certain. Marks in the grass, perhaps, or a trace of the thief's haste. For now, Grayson's cool detachment had given her another piece of the puzzle, though it fit nowhere yet. She thought of her old friend, Lady Hartwell, whose husband had once judged a horse show and let slip a secret in his too perfect composure. People, Miss Marple knew, betrayed themselves in what they did not say as much as in what they did. Back at her cottage, she found Florence setting out a pot of tea and a plate of shortbread. "They're saying at the shop that the judge was arguing with the colonel last week," Florence said, her voice low with gossip. "Something about the Fates budget, and Mr. Worthington's been seen at the Blue Boar talking to a man with a van." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking like a metronome. The judge's disdain, Tommy's fear, the colonel's outrage, and Worthington's charm were all threads in a tapestry she was beginning to see. The Bentley's theft was no random act, but a move in a game someone had planned with care. As the rain drummed against her windows, Miss Marple's mind was already tracing the next step, her quiet resolve as steady as the falling rain. Chapter 5. The Collector's Charm. The rain had softened to a drizzle by mid-morning, leaving St. Mary's Mead glistening under a tentative sun. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella tucked under her arm, walked briskly toward the Blue Boar Inn, where Mr. Percival Worthington, the enigmatic collector, was staying. Her mind buzzed with the threads she had gathered. Colonel Ashby's bluster, Tommy Pierce's nervous confession, Judge Grayson's cool disdain, and the cryptic note with P.W. that pointed to the man she was about to meet. Her lavender gloves matched her scarf, and her expression as she nodded to passers-by was one of serene purpose, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. The Blue Boar, a timbered inn with a sagging roof and a sign depicting a rather optimistic pig, exuded the cozy charm of old England. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and ale, and a fire crackled in the hearth despite the summer warmth. Miss Marple found Mr. Worthington in the private parlor, a room adorned with brass, horse brasses, and faded hunting prints. He rose as she entered, his tailored suit immaculate, his smile as polished as the Bentley itself. In his early 50s, with silver at his temples and a manner that suggested both wealth and breeding, he was the picture of urban sophistication in this rustic setting. "Miss Marple, what a delightful surprise," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "I understand you're something of a village institution. Please, join me." He gestured to a cushioned chair, his charm effortless but calculated, like a man accustomed to winning trust. Miss Marple settled into the chair, her handbag resting on her lap. "You're very kind, Mr. Worthington," she said, her tone warm but her eyes keen. "I thought we might chat about the fate. It was quite the event, wasn't it? Such a pity about Colonel Ashby's car." Worthington's smile didn't falter, but his eyes flickered, a brief shadow crossing his face. "A tragedy," he agreed, leaning back with a studied ease. "That Bentley was a masterpiece. I confess I spent some time admiring it. A 1928 4.5-liter, you know, rare as a unicorn. Whoever took it knew its value." He shook his head as if mourning the loss, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers drummed lightly on the armrest, a rhythm too deliberate to be unconscious. "Indeed," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "You're a collector, I understand. You must have quite a few such treasures yourself." Worthington's smile widened, and he leaned forward, his enthusiasm genuine. Or so it seemed. "A modest collection, but I'm proud of it. Early Bentleys, a Rolls-Royce Phantom, a few others. I've a passion for the craftsmanship of that era. The Bentley, though, it would have been the crown jewel." He paused, his gaze meeting hers, and added lightly, "Not that I'd steal it, of course. I prefer to acquire my pieces legitimately." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile, her knitting needles idle in her bag, but her mind as busy as ever. "Of course," she said. "But you did spend some time with the car, I believe. Tommy Pierce mentioned you asked about its engine, its history. You must have been quite taken with it." Worthington shrugged, his nonchalance almost too perfect. "I'm a curious man, Miss Marple. I asked young Pierce a few questions, technical details mostly. He's a knowledgeable lad, though a bit jumpy. I suppose he's feeling the heat now, with the colonel pointing fingers." His tone was sympathetic, but there was a glint in his eye, as if he enjoyed the village's turmoil. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest. "Poor Tommy is in a difficult spot," she said, "and the colonel is so very upset. You were at the fete all afternoon, I presume. Perhaps you saw something that might help Constable Harris?" Worthington's fingers stilled, and he leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "I was there. Until the awards, yes. Wandered the stalls, admired the cars, chatted with a few locals. I didn't notice anything odd, I'm afraid. The crowd was lively, and I was distracted by the spectacle." His smile returned, but Miss Marple caught a momentary pause, as if he were choosing his words with care. She shifted the conversation, her tone conversational. "I noticed you have quite a few books here," she said, gesturing to a stack on the table beside him. Automotive journals, a biography of W.O. Bentley, and a sketchbook lay in neat order. "You must spend a great deal of time studying your passion." Worthington's eyes lit up, and he reached for the sketchbook. "A hobby of mine," he said, flipping it open to reveal detailed drawings of vintage cars, including a precise rendering of a 1928 Bentley. "I like to capture their essence, you see. It's not just about owning them. It's about understanding their soul." His voice was warm, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the sketch, its accuracy striking. She also noted a locked trunk in the corner of the room, its brass fittings gleaming, and wondered what treasures or secrets it held. "You have a fine eye for detail," she said, her voice admiring. "Such dedication must make a car like the Colonel's irresistible. Almost tempting, one might say." Worthington laughed, a rich sound that filled the parlor. "Tempting, yes, but I'm no thief, Miss Marple. I have my reputation to consider. Besides, a car like that can't be hidden easily. It's too distinctive." He closed the sketchbook, his movements smooth but deliberate, and Miss Marple sensed a door closing in his manner. She rose, smoothing her gloves. "You've been most gracious, Mr. Worthington," she said. "I'm sure Constable Harris will appreciate any help you can offer. It's such a small village. Things have a way of coming to light." Her words were gentle, but her eyes held his for a moment, searching for a crack in his polished facade. As she stepped out into the drizzle, the inn's sign creaking above her, Miss Marple's mind was alight with impressions. Worthington's charm was a shield, she thought, wielded with the skill of a man who knew its power. His interest in the Bentley was more than academic, and his sketchbook suggested an obsession that went beyond admiration. The locked trunk nagged at her, a detail that didn't fit his open demeanor, and his mention of Tommy's jumpiness, so casually dropped, felt like a nudge, a subtle push to direct suspicion elsewhere. She thought of her old friend, Mrs. Bantry, whose cousin had once been charmed by a smooth-talking art dealer, only to find her paintings replaced with forgeries. Charm, Miss Marple knew, was often a mask for calculation, and Worthington's was too perfect to be entirely innocent. The note in Tommy's pocket, with its P.W., pointed to him, but she cautioned herself against jumping to conclusions. A clever man might leave such a clue to mislead, or another might use his initials to cast blame. As she walked toward the village green, the drizzle dampening her scarf, Miss Marple resolved to visit the showgrounds again. The grass might hold traces of the Bentley's departure, and she needed to see where Tommy had gone for that cloth. Worthington's story, like Grayson's and the Colonel's, was too tidy, too polished. She thought of the fete, the crowd's chaos, the moment of opportunity at 4:30. Someone had seized it, and Worthington's hunger for the Bentley made him a likely candidate, but not the only one. Back at her cottage, Florence greeted her with a fresh pot of tea and the latest village talk. "They're saying Mr. Worthington's been asking about garages to rent," she said, her eyes wide. "Big enough for a car, they reckon." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. A garage, a van, a locked trunk. The pieces were mounting, but the picture was still blurred. As the drizzle turned to rain, drumming against her windows, Miss Marple's mind traced the threads of Worthington's charm, searching for the one that would unravel the truth. Chapter 6. A Clue in the Grass. The rain had cleared by noon, leaving St. Mary's Mead bathed in a soft, silvery light that made the village green shimmer like a freshly washed quilt. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella now folded and tucked into her wicker basket, set out for the showgrounds where Colonel Ashby's Bentley had vanished. Her sensible shoes sank slightly into the damp earth, and her lavender coat, buttoned against the lingering chill, gave her the appearance of a harmless elderly lady out for a stroll. But her sharp blue eyes, scanning the ground with quiet intensity, betrayed the purpose that drove her. The threads of the mystery, Tommy's note, Grayson's disdain, Worthington's charm, and the Colonel's outrage, were weaving together in her mind. But she needed something tangible, a trace left by the thief in their haste. The showgrounds, now deserted save for a few volunteers stacking chairs, bore the scars of the fates' bustle, trampled grass, scattered programs, and the faint outlines of stalls. The roped-off area where the Bentley had stood was undisturbed, its velvet cords still staked into the earth, a silent testament to the car's absence. Miss Marple paused at the edge, her basket resting lightly on her arm, and surveyed the scene. The grass was flattened where the Bentley's weight had pressed, but the surrounding area held subtler signs, marks that might tell a story to one who knew how to read them. She knelt, her movements careful, as if adjusting a wayward shoelace, and her eyes caught a glint in the grass. There, half hidden among the blades, was a cufflink, its silver surface etched with the initials P.W. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind flashing to the note in Tommy's pocket, also marked P.W. She slipped the cufflink into her handkerchief, tucking it into her basket with the care of a collector preserving a rare specimen. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple knew that small things often held great weight. She rose, her gaze sweeping the ground for more. A few paces away, near the edge of the roped area, she spotted a faint impression in the damp earth. Not the wide, heavy tread of the Bentley's tires, but a narrower track, like that of a van or a smaller vehicle. The mark curved toward the woods that bordered the green, where a dirt path led to a seldom-used lane. Miss Marple followed it, her steps deliberate, noting how the track grew fainter as it reached firmer ground, then vanished entirely at the path's edge. She stood for a moment, her eyes tracing the line of trees, their branches heavy with recent rain. A van, she thought, could have slipped through here, unnoticed in the fate's chaos. She recalled Florence's gossip about Worthington inquiring about a van, and the cufflink's initials seemed to point directly to him. Yet Miss Marple cautioned herself against haste. A cufflink could be dropped by accident or planted with intent. She thought of her friend, Mrs. Clement, whose nephew had once lost a cufflink in a quarrel, only for it to be found later, used to frame him for a theft he didn't commit. People, she knew, were cleverer than they seemed, and Worthington's polished charm might hide a mind capable of such a ruse. Turning back to the showgrounds, Miss Marple retraced her steps to the spot where Tommy had said he fetched his cloth. The refreshment tent, now dismantled, had stood nearby, its canvas flaps open to the crowd. She pictured Tommy hurrying there, his absence brief but critical. Perhaps no more than 2 minutes, he'd claimed. She paced the distance, her steps measured, and found it plausible. The tent had been crowded, the judge's table visible, but not commanding attention. Grayson's alibi of being there all afternoon seemed solid, but Miss Marple wondered if he, too, had stepped away, perhaps unnoticed in the bustle. She paused by the roped area again, her mind turning over the sequence of events. The colonel had left for the pie contest at 2 p.m., returning at 4 p.m. to check the Bentley. Tommy had stepped away at 4:30, and by 6 the car was gone. The window of opportunity was narrow, but not impossible. A skilled thief, familiar with the car's locks and the village's rhythm, could have acted swiftly. Worthington, with his knowledge of vintage cars, was a candidate, but so was anyone who knew the Bentley's value and its vulnerabilities. As she stood there, a groundskeeper approached, a grizzled man named Mr. Higgs, who tipped his cap. "Looking for something, Miss Marple?" he asked, his eyes curious. "Folks are saying it's a gang from Danemouth what took the colonel's car." Miss Marple smiled, her expression disarming. "Oh, just stretching my legs, Mr. Higgs," she said. "But since you mention it, did you notice anything odd during the fete? A vehicle, perhaps? Or someone near the Bentley who shouldn't have been?" Higgs scratched his chin, his brow furrowing. "Can't say I did, miss. I was busy with the bins, you see. But I did see that London gent, Worthington, is it, talking to young Tommy by the car. Looked friendly enough, but Tommy seemed a bit off, like he was nervous. And there was a van, come to think of it, parked by the woods late in the day. Didn't think much of it, thought it was for the stalls." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her face remained serene. "A van, you say? Did you see who was driving it?" Higgs shook his head. "Too far off, miss. It was gone by the time I looked again. Plain sort of thing, gray or white, I reckon." He shrugged, then added, "Mind you, the judge was about 2. Saw him walking toward the woods round 5, but he was back at the table quick enough." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind alight with this new thread. A van by the woods, Worthington's conversation with Tommy, Grayson's brief absence. The pieces were mounting, but the pattern was still elusive. She thought of the cufflink, its silver gleaming in her handkerchief, and wondered if it was a careless mistake or a deliberate misdirection. Worthington's sketchbook, with its precise drawing of the Bentley, suggested a man obsessed, but Grayson's pristine shoes and Higgs's mention of his walk to the woods hinted at something more. As she made her way back to her cottage, the sun breaking through the clouds, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the village's rhythm. The fate had been a distraction, a perfect cover for a bold theft. Someone had known the Bentley's value, the Colonel's habits, and Tommy's vulnerability. The cufflink and the tire mark were clues, but they were not the whole story. She needed to learn more about the van and about Worthington's movements after the fate. And Grayson, his aloofness was a shield, but shields could crack. At her cottage, Florence greeted her with a pot of tea and a fresh wave of gossip. "They're saying at the post office that Mr. Worthington's been seen with a man from Danemouth," she said, her voice hushed. "A dealer in car parts, shady type." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking as she settled into her armchair. The cufflink, the tire mark, the van, the dealer. The threads were tightening, but the knot remained. As the afternoon light filtered through her lace curtains, Miss Marple's mind was already planning her next step, her quiet resolve as unyielding as the oak outside her window. Chapter 7. The Village Gossip. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary's Mead, casting a warm glow across the village's cobbled lanes and thatched cottages. Miss Jane Marple, her basket swinging lightly at her side, made her way to the post office, where the pulse of village life beat strongest. Her lavender hat, adorned with a single silk rose, bobbed as she walked, and her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the familiar faces of neighbors exchanging pleasantries. The theft of Colonel Ashby's Bentley had set the village abuzz, and Miss Marple knew that gossip, though often muddled, could hold grains of truth. The cufflink with P.W., the van's tire mark, Tommy's nervous confession, Grayson's aloofness, and Worthington's charm were all threads in her mind, but she needed more. Whispers, perhaps, that might illuminate the shadows. The post office, a cramped room smelling of ink and wax, was presided over by Mrs. Price, a woman whose knack for collecting tidbits rivaled Miss Marple's own. Behind the counter, Mrs. Price's spectacles glinted as she sorted letters, her ears ever attuned to the chatter of customers. A small queue had formed. Mrs. Weatherby, the baker's wife, and young Elsie, the vicar's maid, each eager to share their version of the Bentley's disappearance. Miss Marple joined them, her expression one of mild curiosity, though her mind was as focused as a lens. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as she handed over a letter to be stamped. "The village is quite lively with talk of the Colonel's car, isn't it?" Mrs. Price's eyes sparkled, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Lively's putting it mildly, Miss Marple. Why, they're saying it's a professional job, thieves from London, or maybe even abroad, though I've my own thoughts." She paused for effect, glancing at the others, who leaned in eagerly. Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Do share, Mrs. Price," she said, her tone encouraging. "You always hear such interesting things." Mrs. Price needed no further prompting. "Well," she began, "I was at the fete, you know, helping with the tea stall, and I saw that van, gray it was, or maybe white, parked near the woods just before 6. Didn't think much of it then, but now I wonder. The driver was a stranger, not one of our lads, kept his cap low, didn't talk to anyone. And then, poof, it was gone when the shouting started. She nodded sagely, as if the van's presence solved the mystery entirely. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her basket, seemed to itch for movement, but she kept her hands still, her mind filing away the detail. "A van, you say?" she murmured. "How curious. Did you see where it went?" Mrs. Price shook her head, her spectacles slipping slightly. "No, miss, it was too busy with the tea, but I did hear something else." She lowered her voice further, and Mrs. Weatherby and Elsie leaned closer. "Young Tommy Pierce. He's been in a right state. My cousin's boy works at the bank, says Tommy's been borrowing money to pay off gambling debts. Owes a tidy sum to some rough types in Danemouth, they say. If you ask me, he might have had a hand in it, maybe sold the colonel out." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite concern, though she had already heard of Tommy's debts from the colonel and Tommy himself. The repetition was useful, confirming the rumor's persistence, but she suspected Mrs. Price had more to offer. "Poor lad," she said. "It's hard to think he'd betray the colonel, though. And what of others at the fete? That Mr. Worthington, for instance. He seemed quite taken with the Bentley." Mrs. Price's eyes widened, and she seized the new thread with relish. "Oh, that London gent. Very smooth, isn't he? I saw him at the Blue Boar last night, dining with a man I didn't know. Shifty-looking, with a scar on his cheek. My nephew says he's a dealer in car parts, not the honest kind, if you catch my drift." They were talking low, heads together, and Worthington passed him a packet. Could have been money, could have been papers. Makes you wonder what he's up to, doesn't it? Miss Marple's mind sparked at this, the image of Worthington's locked trunk flashing before her. A dealer in car parts, possibly connected to the van, suggested a network, a plan beyond a single thief's greed. She kept her face serene, though her thoughts raced. "Most interesting," she said. "And the judge, Mr. Grayson, he was at the fete, of course. Did you notice him?" Mrs. Price sniffed, her tone turning tart. "Oh, him. Always acting like he's above us all. I heard he's had money troubles since that land deal went sour a few years back. My sister's friend works at his house, says he's been selling off silver to make ends meet. At the fete, he was at the judge's table, but I saw him slip away round 5. Toward the woods. Said he was taking a call, but who takes a call in the trees?" She raised an eyebrow, inviting agreement. Mrs. Weatherby chimed in, her voice eager. "That's right. I saw him too, looking all stiff and proper, but he was gone a good 10 minutes. And those shoes of his, clean as a whistle, even with all that dust, makes you think he wasn't walking where he said." Elsie, the vicar's maid, nodded vigorously. "And the colonel was in a right state, shouting at everyone. My brother says he heard him arguing with Tommy before the pie contest, telling him to keep his eyes on the car or else. If you ask me, the colonel's too quick to blame others. Maybe he's hiding something himself." Miss Marple listened, her expression one of quiet interest, but her mind was weaving these snippets into the larger tapestry. The van by the woods, seen by both Mrs. Price and Mr. Higgs, was no coincidence. Worthington's meeting with a shady dealer suggested a motive tied to his collection, perhaps a scheme to acquire the Bentley illicitly. Grayson's financial strain and brief absence from the judge's table raised questions about his alibi, and his pristine shoes, echoed by Mrs. Weatherby's observation, hinted at a man careful to avoid traces of his movements. As for the colonel, Elsie's comment about his argument with Tommy added a new layer to his outrage, suggesting a man whose trust was fraying. She purchased her stamps, thanking Mrs. Price with a smile. "You've a remarkable ear for the village's pulse, Mrs. Price," she said. I'm sure Constable Harris will find your observations most helpful." As she stepped out into the sunlight, her basket light but her thoughts heavy, Miss Marple paused to consider her next move. The gossip had confirmed much of what she suspected, but it also opened new paths. The van was a key, she thought, and Worthington's connection to a dealer warranted closer scrutiny. Grayson's absence, however brief, was a crack in his polished facade, and the Colonel's quickness to blame Tommy might mask his own vulnerabilities. She thought of her old friend, Miss Hartwell, whose village had once been scandalized by a stolen painting, the thief uncovered through a servant's idle remark about a stranger's boots. Gossip, Miss Marple knew, was like a river, muddy but carrying fragments of truth. The cufflink, the tire mark, and now the van and the dealer were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. She needed to revisit Tommy, to press him on the note's origins, and perhaps to learn more about Grayson's financial troubles. Worthington, too, required watching. His charm was a veil, and she intended to lift it. As she walked toward her cottage, the village green sparkled with dew, and children laughed in the distance. Miss Marple's needles, still in her basket, would resume their clicking soon, but for now, her mind was her tool, knitting together the whispers of St. Mary's Mead. The Bentley's theft was a bold act, planned with care, and the truth, she was certain, lay just beyond the next thread. She tugged. Chapter 8. The Mechanic's Secret. The late afternoon light filtered through the elms of St. Mary's Mead, casting dappled shadows on the lane leading to Tommy Pierce's garage. Miss Jane Marple, her basket swinging gently at her side, walked with the quiet determination of one who sensed a knot in the thread of her inquiry. The village gossip, rich with whispers of vans, shady dealers, and Grayson's pristine shoes, had sharpened her focus, but the cufflink marked P.W., and Tommy's nervous tail tugged at her most insistently. She needed to see the young mechanic again, to probe the edges of his fear and uncover what lay behind that cryptic note. Her lavender coat was buttoned against the cooling air, and her eyes, bright and unyielding, scanned the familiar path for anything amiss. The garage stood as she had left it, its brick walls streaked with rain and its tin roof glinting faintly in the sun. But as Miss Marple approached, she caught a faint wisp of smoke curling from the backyard, a sharp contrast to the stillness of the scene. Quickening her step, she rounded the corner and found Tommy crouched over a small fire, feeding papers into the flames. His lanky frame was tense, his face pale as he glanced up, startled by her approach. The fire crackled, consuming a handful of documents, but Miss Marple's keen eyes noted a torn envelope among the ashes, its edge bearing a faint wax seal. "Tommy," she said, her voice gentle but carrying a note of reproach. "Burning papers on such a fine afternoon? Surely there's a better way to tidy up." Tommy scrambled to his feet, his hands smudged with soot, his eyes wide with panic. "Miss Marple, I didn't see you there. It's just old bills, nothing important." His voice trembled, and he kicked at the fire, scattering embers in a futile attempt to hide his task. Miss Marple stepped closer, her expression one of kindly concern, though her mind was as sharp as a needle. "Old bills can tell stories, Tommy," she said, her tone soft but insistent. "And stories have a way of mattering, especially now. You wouldn't want to destroy something that could help find the Colonel's car, would you?" Tommy's shoulders slumped, and he wiped his hands on his overalls, leaving streaks of ash. "I didn't do nothing wrong, Miss Marple," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swear, I didn't take the Bentley. I know what folks are saying about my debts, about me looking the other way, but I didn't." Miss Marple settled onto a nearby crate, her basket resting on her lap, and fixed him with a steady gaze. "I believe you mean that, Tommy," she said. "But that note you showed me, the one with PW, it suggests someone thought you might be persuaded. Tell me more about it. When did you find it, and who knew you were in debt?" Tommy hesitated, his eyes darting to the dying fire. Then, as if the weight of her gaze was too much, he sank onto another crate, his hands twisting together. "It was the morning of the fete," he said. "I opened my toolbox to get my polishing kit, and there it was, tucked inside, just like I told you. Look the other way at 4:30. Your debts are cleared. PW. I didn't know what to make of it. I thought it was a joke at first, but, well, everyone knows I owe money. I got in deep with some blokes in Danemouth, betting on the horses, stupid stuff. The colonel heard about it, gave me a lecture, but he didn't sack me. I figured maybe someone was trying to trick me." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind turning over his words. "And did you show the note to anyone? The colonel, perhaps, or Constable Harris?" Tommy shook his head, his face flushing. "No, miss. I was scared. If the colonel saw it, he'd think I was in on it. And the constable, well, I didn't want him poking into my debts. I thought I could handle it, keep my eyes open at the fate. But then I needed that cloth, and I stepped away. Just for a minute, I swear. And when I got back, the car was gone." His voice cracked, and he buried his face in his hands. Miss Marple's expression softened, but her mind was relentless, sifting through his story for cracks. "And this Mr. Worthington," she said, "you spoke with him at the fete, didn't you? About the Bentley's engine, its history. Did he say anything that struck you as odd?" Tommy looked up, his eyes narrowing. He was friendly, asked a lot of questions, how the engine ran, if the colonel ever drove it himself, said he had a collection, wanted to know if the Bentley was for sale. I told him no, the colonel would never part with it. He laughed, said something about every car having its price, but he didn't mention no note, and I didn't bring it up. I didn't trust him, not with that smile of his. He paused, then added, "He was around the car a lot, though. Kept coming back, like he couldn't stay away." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing the handkerchief in her basket where the PW cufflink lay. "And after you found the note, did anyone else approach you? Anyone who might have known about your troubles?" Tommy's face darkened. "There was a man, not from the village. Saw him in Danemouth a week before the fete. Rough type, said he worked for my creditor. Told me I'd better pay up soon or there'd be trouble. Didn't see him at the fete, but I wondered if he left the note, maybe using someone else's name to scare me." He shivered, despite the warm air. Miss Marple's mind sparked at this, the mention of a Danemouth connection echoing Mrs. Price's gossip about Worthington's shady associate. She leaned forward, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "You've been very brave to tell me this, Tommy," she said. "But you mustn't keep such things to yourself any longer. Take that note to Constable Harris and tell him everything about the note, the man from Danemouth, all of it. Secrets only make the trap tighter, you know." Tommy nodded, his eyes glistening. "I will, Miss Marple. I didn't want to let the colonel down. He's been good to me, even with my mistakes." He glanced at the fire, now smoldering, and added, I'll stop burning things. I was just scared they'd find something to pin on me. Miss Marple rose, her basket light in her hands. "You're doing the right thing, Tommy," she said, "and don't worry too much. The truth has a way of sorting itself out." She paused at the garage door, her gaze lingering on the toolbox, its lid still ajar. "And perhaps lock that toolbox in the future. It seems to attract more than tools." As she stepped into the lane, the sun dipping toward the horizon, Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirl of connections. Tommy's fear was genuine, his story consistent, but the note suggested someone had targeted his weakness. Worthington, with his P.W. initials and obsessive interest in the Bentley, was the obvious suspect, but the Danemouth creditor introduced a new possibility. A third party, perhaps manipulating Tommy to create a distraction. She thought of her old friend, Miss Powlett, whose nephew had once been coerced into a theft by a lender's threats, only to find himself a pawn in a larger scheme. Tommy, she suspected, was such a pawn. But whose hand moved him? The cufflink, the van's tire mark, and now the burned papers and Danemouth connection were pieces of a puzzle, but the edges didn't yet align. Worthington's meeting with a dealer, Grayson's absence from the judge's table, and the colonel's quick accusations all pointed to a web of motives: greed, envy, desperation. Miss Marple resolved to learn more about the Danemouth connection, perhaps through Constable Harris, who might know of local creditors. And Worthington's locked trunk at the Blue Boar nagged at her, a secret waiting to be opened. Back at her cottage, Florence greeted her with a pot of tea and a fresh wave of gossip. "They're saying at the butcher's that Tommy was seen arguing with a stranger last week," she said. "Some think he's in deeper than he lets on." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking as she settled into her armchair. Tommy's secret was out, but it was only a thread, not the whole cloth. As the evening light faded, Miss Marple's mind was already tracing the next step, her quiet resolve as steady as the ticking of her mantel clock. Chapter 9. The Judge's Alibi. The morning mist clung to St. Mary's Mead like a delicate veil, softening the outlines of its cottages and lending an air of mystery to the village's quiet lanes. Miss Jane Marple, her basket tucked under her arm, set out for Judge Harold Grayson's residence, a stately house of red brick and ivy just beyond the churchyard. Her lavender shawl was draped neatly over her shoulders, and her steps, though measured, carried the purpose of one who sensed the threads of a mystery drawing tighter. Tommy Pierce's confession, the P.W. cufflink, the van's tire mark, and the village gossip about a shady dealer had sharpened her focus, but Grayson's cool detachment nagged at her. His pristine shoes and brief absence from the judge's table hinted at a crack in his polished facade, and Miss Marple intended to probe it gently but firmly. Grayson's home, the Elms, stood behind a wrought-iron gate, its gardens meticulous despite rumors of financial strain. Miss Marple rang the bell, and a young maid, her apron crisp but her eyes curious, ushered her into a drawing room of faded grandeur. The furniture was fine, but worn, the silver candlesticks polished but fewer than one might expect. Grayson himself appeared moments later, his tall frame as rigid as ever, his gray suit immaculate. His steel-gray eyes met hers with a flicker of irritation, quickly masked by a thin smile. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice measured. "An unexpected visit. I presume this is about the colonel's car? I've told you all I know, but please, sit." He gestured to a high-backed chair, his courtesy formal but lacking warmth. Miss Marple settled into the chair, her basket resting on her lap, her expression one of polite deference. "You're very kind, Judge Grayson," she said, her tone soft as a summer breeze. "I won't take much of your time. The theft has caused such a stir, and I thought you might have recalled some small detail from the fete, something overlooked in the moment." Grayson's lips thinned, and he sat opposite her, his fingers steepled as if presiding over a courtroom. "I've been over it with Constable Harris," he said, his tone clipped. "I was at the judge's table from 3 until the awards at 5, then stayed until the commotion at 6. I saw nothing unusual. Crowds, noise, the usual chaos of a village event. The Bentley was there one moment, gone the next. A bold theft, but not my affair." His words were precise, his alibi rehearsed, but Miss Marple noted a faint tension in his jaw, as if he resented the scrutiny. She tilted her head, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Of course," she said. "Your duties must have kept you busy, but I understand you stepped away briefly, perhaps around 5? Mrs. Price mentioned seeing you near the woods, taking a call, I believe." Grayson's eyes narrowed, and for a moment his composure wavered. "Mrs. Price talks too much," he said sharply, then caught himself, his tone softening. "Yes, I took a telephone call, a personal matter, nothing to do with the fete. I was gone 10 minutes, no more, and the judge's table was never unattended. My colleagues were there." He leaned back, his fingers resuming their steepled pose, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance toward the window, as if he wished to escape her gaze. "A personal matter," she repeated, her voice gentle but probing. "How inconvenient, during such a busy event. And yet you returned quickly, with your shoes so remarkably clean, despite the dusty showgrounds. I couldn't help but notice at the fete. Your polish was quite impeccable." Grayson's face stiffened, and he shifted in his seat, the movement slight but telling. "I'm careful where I step, Miss Marple," he said, his tone dry. "The showgrounds were dry enough, and I kept to the paths. I fail to see how my shoes are relevant." His voice carried a hint of scorn, but Miss Marple's serene expression never wavered. "Oh, it's a small thing," she said, her tone disarming. "But small things can be so revealing, don't you find? Like the way you spoke of the Colonel's car at the village hall. Such a fine machine, but perhaps a touch ostentatious for your taste." Grayson's mouth twitched, and he leaned forward, his eyes cold. "Ashby's pride in that car is no secret," he said. "He parades it like a trophy, inviting envy and trouble. If you're looking for motives, Miss Marple, you do. Better to focus on young Pierce. His debts are common knowledge, and he was supposed to guard the car. Or that collector Worthington. His interest was obvious, almost predatory." His deflection was swift, but Miss Marple noted the edge in his voice, as if he were eager to shift her attention. She nodded, her hands resting lightly on her basket. "Mr. Worthington does seem passionate about such cars," she said, "and Tommy's troubles are unfortunate. But envy, Judge Grayson, can stir the heart as much as greed. I've heard whispers of your own difficulties. A bad investment, perhaps? It must be trying, maintaining such a fine home under strain." Grayson's face darkened, and he rose, his movements abrupt. "You overstep, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low but sharp. "My finances are my own concern. I had no hand in this theft, and I resent the implication. I was at the judge's table, as I've said, and I saw nothing. If you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to." He gestured toward the door, his courtesy barely masking his anger. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her shawl. "Of course, Judge Grayson," she said, her tone as gentle as ever. "I meant no offense. It's only that the village is so small, and secrets have a way of surfacing. Thank you for your time." She paused at the threshold, her eyes lingering on a small table, where a telephone sat, its cord neatly coiled. "Your maid mentioned you took that call in the house, I believe. Odd that you went to the woods for it." Grayson froze, his hand on the door frame, but he recovered quickly. "The maid is mistaken," he said curtly. "I took the call at the Fates office tent. Good day, Miss Marple." His dismissal was final, but Miss Marple's mind was alight with the slip. The maid's words, overheard as she entered, had placed Grayson's call inside, not in a tent. As she stepped into the misty garden, the gate creaking behind her, Miss Marple's thoughts raced. Grayson's alibi was fraying, his absence from the table now confirmed by multiple witnesses, and his pristine shoes suggested a man careful to leave no trace. His financial troubles, hinted at by Mrs. Price and now provoked by her gentle probe, gave him a motive: envy of the Colonel's wealth, perhaps, or a desperate need for funds. Yet his quickness to point to Tommy and Worthington echoed the Colonel's own deflections, a pattern that suggested either truth or a shared desire to mislead. She thought of her old friend, Mrs. Eldridge, whose banker husband had once hidden a financial scandal behind a facade of respectability, only to be undone by a servant's casual remark. Grayson's irritability, his slip about the call, and his too clean shoes were threads in a tapestry of suspicion. The PW cufflink still pointed to Worthington, but Miss Marple wondered if Grayson's absence at 5 o'clock, near the woods where the van was seen, was more than coincidence. As she walked back to her cottage, the mist lifting to reveal a pale sun, Miss Marple resolved to speak to Constable Harris. The maid's comment about the telephone needed verification, and the van's presence required further inquiry. Worthington's shady associate, Tommy's debts, and now Grayson's shaky alibi were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. She needed to know more about that call, and what Grayson might have been doing in the woods. At her cottage, Florence greeted her with a steaming teapot and the latest village talk. "They're saying at the grocer's that Judge Grayson's been short-tempered lately," she said, "snapped at his maid for misplacing a letter, and that Mr. Worthington's been asking about local garages again." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking as she settled into her armchair. The judge's alibi was crumbling, but the truth was still a shadow. As the mist cleared outside, Miss Marple's mind was already tracing the next thread, her quiet resolve as steady as the village clock's chime. Chapter 10. The Collector's Lair. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting St. Mary's Mead in hues of twilight as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the village outskirts, where a rented garage stood in the shadow of a crumbling stone wall. Constable Harris had agreed, with some reluctance, to her request for a discreet search of the premises leased by Mr. Percival Worthington, the charming collector whose polished exterior was beginning to show cracks. Her lavender gloves were neatly tucked into her basket, and her shawl, draped against the evening chill, gave her the appearance of a harmless spinster out for a stroll. But her sharp blue eyes, glinting in the fading light, were fixed on the task ahead, her mind weaving together the threads of Tommy's confession, Grayson's shaky alibi, the PW cufflink, and the village whispers of a shady dealer. The garage, a low structure of weathered brick, sat at the end of a narrow lane, its doors padlocked and its windows obscured by grime. Constable Harris, a stout man with a mustache that rivaled Colonel Ashby's, met her there, his lantern casting a flickering glow. "I hope you're right about this, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with respect. "Worthington's a smooth one, but if he's got the Colonel's car, we'll have him." He produced a key, obtained from the landlord, and unlocked the door with a creak that echoed in the quiet. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and dust, and the lantern's light revealed a clutter of crates, tarps, and automotive tools. Miss Marple's gaze swept the space, noting a workbench strewn with bolts and a stack of motoring magazines, their covers featuring vintage cars. Her heart quickened as she spotted a tarp-covered shape in the far corner, its bulk too large for a mere crate. She nodded to Constable Harris, who, with a grunt, pulled back the tarp to reveal the unmistakable form of Colonel Ashby's 1928 Bentley 4.5-liter, its emerald green body gleaming even in the dim light. "There it is," Harris said, his voice a mix of triumph and disbelief. "Right under our noses, Worthington's got some explaining to do." He bent to examine the car, confirming the license plate matched the Colonel's description. Miss Marple, her expression serene but her mind racing, stepped closer, her eyes scanning the vehicle for clues. The Bentley was pristine, its chrome untarnished, suggesting it had been moved with care. She noted a faint scuff on the fender, barely visible, and a smudge of grease on the door handle, as if someone had handled it in haste. "Most interesting," she murmured, her fingers brushing the handkerchief in her basket where the P.W. cufflink lay. "But let us look further, Constable. A car like this doesn't hide itself." Harris nodded, his lantern sweeping the garage. Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small table near the workbench, where a logbook lay open, its pages filled with meticulous notes in a neat hand. She flipped through it, her eyes catching phrases like 1928 Bentley 4.5-liter and final piece for collection. The entries detailed Worthington's acquisitions, dates, prices, and sources, but one stood out, a recent note about a Danemouth contact for discreet transport. Her mind flashed to Mrs. Price's gossip about Worthington's meeting with a shady dealer and the van seen near the woods. "Constable," she said, her voice soft but firm, "this logbook may be important. It suggests Mr. Worthington planned to move something, perhaps the Bentley, with help from outside the village." Harris peered over her shoulder, his brow furrowing. "Looks damning, Miss Marple. And look here." He pointed to a corner of the floor where a second cufflink, identical to the one she'd found, lay in the dust, its P.W. initials catching the lantern's light. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind weighing the coincidence. Two cufflinks, both marked, seemed almost too convenient, but their presence tied Worthington to the scene with a certainty that was hard to dismiss. She turned her attention to the crates, their lids loosely stacked. With Harris's help, she opened one, revealing a collection of car parts, spark plugs, gaskets, and a custom ignition switch that matched the Colonel's description of his Bentley's unique lock. "He was thorough," she said, her tone thoughtful. "But perhaps too thorough. A man who leaves such clues might be careless, or clever enough to want them found." Harris scratched his head, his skepticism evident. "You think he planted these, Miss Marple?" "Seems a stretch. The car's here, plain as day." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. "People are rarely as simple as they seem, Constable," she said. "Let us measure these tire marks." She gestured to the floor, where faint tracks led from the Bentley to the garage door. Harris, with a tape measure from his pocket, confirmed they matched the narrower tread she'd seen near the showgrounds. A van, not the Bentley's wide tires. As they searched further, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the Fates timeline. Tommy's absence at 4:30, Grayson's walk to the woods at 5, and the van's presence near 6 formed a sequence, but Worthington's role was the linchpin. His logbook suggested a plan, his cufflinks a trail, but she wondered if he was the mastermind or a convenient scapegoat. She thought of her old friend, Mrs. Langley, whose son had once been framed for a jewel theft by a rival who left his monogrammed handkerchief at the scene. Worthington's charm, she suspected, hid a mind capable of either crime or misdirection. "Constable," she said as they prepared to leave, "I suggest you secure this garage and speak to Mr. Worthington, but be cautious. He's a man who knows how to talk his way out of trouble. And perhaps inquire about that Danemouth contact. It may lead us further." Harris nodded, locking the garage behind them. "I'll bring him in tonight, Miss Marple. This is solid evidence, thanks to you." He tipped his cap, but Miss Marple's mind was already elsewhere, tracing the threads of the mystery. The Bentley's discovery was a breakthrough, but it raised new questions. Why hide it so close to the village, and why leave such obvious clues? Grayson's absence, Tommy's debts, and the Colonel's quick accusations still lingered, each a piece of a puzzle that refused to snap into place. As she walked back to her cottage, the stars emerging in the twilight sky, Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirl of connections. The logbook, the cufflinks, the van's tracks. All pointed to Worthington, but she cautioned herself against certainty. A clever thief might leave a trail to mislead, and a desperate man might seize an opportunity. She needed to confront Worthington, to test his charm against the weight of evidence, and to verify Grayson's call with the maid. The Danemouth dealer, too, was a thread to tug, perhaps through Harris's contacts. At her cottage, Florence greeted her with a pot of tea and a fresh wave of gossip. "They're saying at the Blue Boar that Worthington's been packing his bags," she said, her eyes wide. "Reckon he's planning to slip away." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking as she settled into her armchair. The collector's lair had yielded its secret, but the truth was still a shadow, waiting to be illuminated. As the night settled over St. Mary's Mead, Miss Marple's mind was already planning the final unraveling, her quiet resolve as steady as the village's ancient oaks. Chapter 11. The Confrontation. The evening air in St. Mary's Mead was cool and fragrant with the scent of blooming jasmine, as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the village hall, where a hastily convened meeting was set to address the theft of Colonel Ashby's Bentley. The discovery of the car in Mr. Percival Worthington's rented garage, along with the damning logbook and the second P.W. cufflink, had sent ripples of excitement through the village. Miss Marple, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, carried her basket with its usual air of innocuous purpose, but her sharp blue eyes were alight with anticipation. The threads of the mystery, Tommy's fear, Grayson's shaky alibi, the Colonel's outrage, and Worthington's calculated charm, were converging, and tonight she intended to weave them into a pattern that would reveal the truth. The village hall was crowded, its oak-paneled walls echoing with the murmurs of villagers eager for answers. Colonel Ashby stood at the front, his mustache bristling with indignation, while Constable Harris, his notebook in hand, maintained a steady presence beside him. Judge Grayson sat stiffly to one side, his gray suit as immaculate as ever, his expression a mask of aloof disdain. Tommy Pierce lingered near the back, his lanky frame hunched, his eyes darting nervously. Mr. Worthington, summoned by Harris, stood near the center, his tailored suit and easy smile undimmed despite the weight of suspicion upon him. Miss Marple took a seat near the front, her knitting needles idle in her basket, her gaze moving from face to face with quiet precision. Constable Harris cleared his throat, calling the meeting to order. "Good evening, folks," he began, his voice steady but carrying the gravity of the moment. "As you've heard, we've found Colonel Ashby's Bentley in a garage rented by Mr. Worthington. We've evidence, cufflinks, a logbook, tire marks, that points to his involvement. But we're here to hear all sides, so let's keep this orderly." The colonel, unable to contain himself, stepped forward, his face crimson. "Orderly, my foot!" he barked. "That man," he jabbed a finger at Worthington, "stole my car, plain as day, hid it in his garage, thought he could make off with it. I demand justice, Harris." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others whispering their own theories. Worthington raised a hand, his smile unruffled. "Colonel, I understand your distress," he said, his voice smooth as polished chrome. "But I assure you I had no part in this. Yes, I rented the garage, for storage, nothing more. I admired your Bentley, as I told Miss Marple, but steal it? Never. I'm a collector, not a thief." His charm was as potent as ever, and a few villagers wavered, caught by his sincerity. Miss Marple, her hands folded in her lap, rose quietly, her presence commanding attention despite her gentle demeanor. "If I may, Constable," she said, her voice clear and unhurried, "I believe we can clarify matters with a few observations." The room fell silent, all eyes on her, and even Worthington's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She began, her tone as calm as a summer afternoon. "The theft of the Bentley was no random act, but a carefully planned one, executed in the chaos of the fate. Let us consider the facts. The car vanished between 4:30 and 6, when Tommy Pierce stepped away briefly to fetch a cloth. A van, seen by Mrs. Price and Mr. Higgs near the woods, left tire marks that match those in Mr. Worthington's garage. A cufflink, marked PW, was found at the showgrounds, and another in the garage, alongside a logbook detailing Mr. Worthington's obsession with acquiring a 1928 Bentley to complete his collection. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room, lingering on Worthington's composed face. Then there is the note found in Tommy's toolbox, urging him to look the other way. At 4:30, signed PW. It suggests someone knew of Tommy's debts and sought to exploit them. Mr. Worthington, you spoke with Tommy at the fete, asking detailed questions about the Bentley. Your logbook mentions a Danemouth contact for discreet transport, and village gossip places you with a shady dealer, a man, perhaps, who drove that van. Worthington's smile tightened, but he spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. Miss Marple, you weave a compelling tale, but it's just that, a tale. The cufflinks, easily lost or planted. The logbook, a record of my interests, not a confession. As for the note, I know nothing of it. Someone could have used my initials to mislead. And the garage? I stored tools there, not stolen cars. If the Bentley was found there, I'd suggest someone else had access. Perhaps young Pierce, whose debts are no secret." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in his eyes, a crack in his polished armor. She continued, undeterred. "A fair point, Mr. Worthington, but let us consider others. Judge Grayson, you were at the judge's table, but you left briefly at 5, seen near the woods where the van was parked. Your financial troubles, mentioned by Mrs. Price, might suggest a motive. Envy of the Colonel's wealth, perhaps, or a need for funds." Grayson's face darkened, his hands clenching, but he remained silent, his silence louder than any protest. "And Colonel Ashby," she went on, her voice gentle but relentless, "your quickness to blame Tommy suggests a trust easily broken. Yet your custom key, kept in your waistcoat, was not used, for the Bentley's ignition was bypassed, a task requiring skill such as Mr. Worthington possesses." The Colonel sputtered, but Miss Marple raised a hand, her authority quiet but undeniable. "The evidence points to Mr. Worthington," she said. "The cufflinks, the logbook, the van's tracks, all lead to his garage. But I confess, the clues are almost too neat. A clever man might leave such a trail to mislead, or another might use his initials to cast blame. Yet the Bentley's presence in the garage is undeniable, and Mr. Worthington's obsession with completing his collection gives him a motive others lack." Worthington stepped forward, his charm giving way to indignation. "This is absurd," he said. "I borrowed the car, yes, to study it. A temporary loan, nothing more. I intended to return it. I'm no thief." His voice rose, and the crowd gasped, sensing the confession beneath his words. Constable Harris moved forward, his hand on his notebook. "A loan, you say? Without the Colonel's permission? That's theft, Mr. Worthington, and you'll answer for it." He signaled to a deputy, who stepped toward Worthington, whose face paled, his charm crumbling under the weight of truth. Miss Marple remained seated, her eyes on Worthington as he was led away, the crowd buzzing with shock. She thought of her old friend, Mrs. Harmon, whose cousin had once been undone by his own arrogance, believing his charm could outwit evidence. Worthington's plan, using Tommy's debts as a distraction, hiring a van to spirit the Bentley away, had been bold, but his obsession had betrayed him. Grayson's absence and the Colonel's anger were side threads, she realized, woven into the tapestry but not the heart of it. As the meeting dispersed, Colonel Ashby approached her, his bluster softened by gratitude. "You've done it, Miss Marple," he said. "Got my car back, and that scoundrel caught. I misjudged young Tommy, thought he was mixed up in it." His voice held a note of shame, and Miss Marple smiled gently, assuring him Tommy's honesty would prevail. She left the hall, the night air cool against her face, her mind already turning over the final threads. Worthington's confession, though partial, closed the case, but she wondered about the Danemouth dealer and the second cufflink's convenient placement. For now, though, the Bentley was safe, and St. Mary's Mead could rest. As she walked home, the stars bright above, Miss Marple's quiet resolve remained, ready for the next mystery the village might weave. Chapter 12. The Quiet of St. Mary's Mead. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary's Mead, bathing the village in a soft golden light that seemed to hush the lingering echoes of the Bentley's theft. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy parlor, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as a half-finished scarf grew in her lap. The familiar scent of lavender from her garden drifted through the open window, mingling with the aroma of freshly brewed tea brought by Florence, her maid, who was still abuzz with the village's reaction to Mr. Percival Worthington's arrest. The Colonel's 1928 Bentley 4.5-liter had been returned to its rightful place in Ashby Manor's garage, and the village hall meeting, with its dramatic unveiling of the thief, was already becoming local legend. Yet Miss Marple's mind, ever restless, turned over the case's final threads, seeking the quiet certainty that comes with understanding. She sipped her tea, her sharp blue eyes gazing past the lace curtains to the green beyond, where children played and life resumed its gentle rhythm. The case had unraveled as she expected, yet each mystery, she knew, left echoes, lessons about human nature that lingered like the scent of rain after a storm. Worthington's polished charm, Tommy Pierce's desperate fear, Judge Grayson's guarded envy, and Colonel Ashby's wounded pride had all played their parts, revealing truths as old as the village itself. Miss Marple's needles paused as she reflected, her thoughts weaving a tapestry as intricate as her knitting. Florence bustled in, her apron slightly askew, her face alight with the morning's gossip. "They're still talking at the post office, Miss Marple," she said, setting down a plate of scones. "Mrs. Price says Mr. Worthington's been taken to Danemouth for questioning, and they found papers in his room, letters to that dealer he met, planning to ship the Bentley abroad. Can you believe the nerve?" She shook her head, her eyes wide with the thrill of scandal. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles resuming their steady click. "People can be quite bold when driven by desire, Florence," she said. "Mr. Worthington wanted that car to crown his collection, and he thought his charm would shield him. But greed, you see, has a way of tripping over itself." She thought of Worthington's confession at the village hall, his claim of a temporary loan, a flimsy excuse that crumbled under the weight of evidence, the cufflinks, the logbook, the van's tire marks, and the Bentley itself, hidden in his rented garage. His plan had been clever, exploiting Tommy's debts to create a distraction, hiring a Danemouth dealer to move the car. But his obsession had been his undoing. The cufflinks, she suspected, were a careless mistake, not a plant, for no one else had motive to frame him. Yet she wondered about the Danemouth dealer, whose role remained shadowy. Constable Harris, she trusted, would pursue that thread, though the village's part in the drama was done. Her mind drifted to Tommy, whose fear had been so palpable in his garage, the burned papers a testament to his panic. He had gone to Harris with the note, as she advised, and his honesty had cleared his name, though not his debts. The colonel, chastened by his rush to blame, had promised to help the lad, perhaps with a loan or a stern word to his creditors. Miss Marple thought of her nephew Raymond's friend, a young man once caught in a similar web of debt, saved by a kind employer's intervention. Tommy, she hoped, would find his way. Judge Grayson, too, lingered in her thoughts. His financial strain and brief absence from the judge's table had made him a suspect, but his pristine shoes and irritable denial suggested pride, not guilt. Envy of the colonel's wealth had clouded his judgment, perhaps, but he had no hand in the theft. Miss Marple recalled her old friend, Mrs. Bantry, whose neighbor had once let envy fester into spite, only to find it consumed him more than his rival. Grayson, she suspected, would guard his secrets more closely now. As for Colonel Ashby, his bluster had softened into gratitude, his faith in Tommy restored. The Bentley, returned to its pedestal, would no doubt be paraded again at next year's fete, though Miss Marple hoped he'd invest in a better lock. Pride, she knew, was a fragile thing, easily bruised but quick to heal in a man like the Colonel. She rose, setting her knitting aside, and stepped into her garden, where the roses glowed in the morning light. The village was quiet now, its rhythm restored, but Miss Marple knew that beneath its calm surface, human nature churned, greed, envy, fear, and kindness, all woven into the fabric of life. The Bentley's theft had been a ripple, not a wave, and St. Mary's Mead would settle back into its sleepy ways until the next mystery stirred. As she clipped a fading bloom, her mind wandered to her old friend, Miss Hartwell, whose village had once been upended by a stolen heirloom, solved through a servant's passing remark. St. Mary's Mead was no different, its secrets hidden in plain sight, waiting for a keen eye to uncover them. Miss Marple's lips curved in a quiet smile, her resolve as steady as the roses at her feet. The Bentley was back, Worthington was caught, and the village was at peace. For now. She returned to her parlor, where Florence was tidying the tea tray. "Will you be out again today, Miss Marple?" she asked, her curiosity undimmed. "They're saying the Colonel's planning a thank-you tea for you." Miss Marple chuckled softly, her needles resuming their dance. "Perhaps, Florence," she said. "But for now, I'm content to sit and knit. The village has had enough excitement, don't you think?" Her eyes twinkled, but her mind, ever alert, was already listening for the next whisper of trouble, knowing that in St. Mary's Mead, the quiet was never quite as it seemed.